It's my pleasure to introduce documentarian and award-winning author Stephen C. Smith. Stephen is a 4-time Emmy-nominated producer and a 16-time Telly Award winner. He has created over 200 documentaries for various media, including the networks AMC, TMC, History Channel, A&E, National Geographic, and Bravo. A former supervising producer of the TV series A&E Biography and AMC Backstory, his project collaborators include George Lucas, Steven Spielberg, Martin Scorsese, Julie Andrews, Sidney Poitier, and Stephen Sondheim. He is author of the books A Heart at Fire's Center, The Life and Music of Bernard Herrmann, and Music by Max Steiner, The Epic Life of Hollywood's Most Influential Composer, which he spoke on this past spring, and it was absolutely fantastic. So both of his books received the ASCAP Foundation Deems Taylor Virgil Thompson Award for Excellence. Please help me welcome Mr. Stephen Smith to the stage.
Thank you. Well, thank you all so much for being here today. It is first I have to say thank you, TJ. Thank you, Aaron, and everyone here at the Rancho Mirage Library. You are wonderful hosts as always. And thank you all for turning out for something new. This is the first edition of a 3-week series that we're launching here at the library, something I thought might be fun, called Hollywood Gamechangers, a look at 3 different movies in different genres that all pushed the envelope, that pushed the boundaries and expanded what movies could do, and certainly inspired other filmmakers to take things ever further. And so how did I choose these movies? Well, I wanted a crime film, I wanted a musical, I wanted some science fiction, and they all had to be a lot of fun to watch. So I think I can promise you that they are that. And since this is a new series, if you enjoy it, please spread the word and tell your friends. There are 2 more weeks to go. And I just wanted to mention, since it's something a little different, what exactly are we doing today? Is it a lecture? Are we watching a movie? Well, it's both. I'm going to talk for about 20 minutes at the beginning about the backstory of our first film, the film we're showing today. And then we're going to watch that film in its entirety. And thank you, Library, for having a great 4K Blu-ray edition, very high-def edition of the film to share with you. I know a number of you have seen it before, but I think it's going to look really good. After the movie, I'm going to share just about 5 or 6 minutes of stories that would be spoilers if I told them too early. So if you can, stick around for those. And if you are still interested in sticking around, I would love to have a little discussion, Q&A with you about the film. So that's it, lecture, movie, and talking afterwards. So with that, let me get out my trusty notes and begin. So yes, a movie that I know many of you have seen, but I'm just curious, how many of you have not seen Double Indemnity before? Okay, all right, very interesting. Well, this is a movie that certainly has many, it set many precedents in the world of noir, and again, I just want to make sure that I'm covering everything here. And I would like to start with an image that is not from this movie, but is certainly germane to the story we're telling. Yes, a rather literally shocking image. You are looking at the first photograph ever taken of an execution, right at the moment that electricity was sent through the body of murderous Ruth Snyder. 1 year earlier, in 1927, in Queens Village, New York, Ruth convinced her husband Albert to take out life insurance. Insurance that would pay extra if Albert died in an act of violence. Then Ruth and her lover, a corset salesman named Judd Gray, murdered Albert. They hit him in the head with an iron window sash weight. Then they chloroformed him. I don't really understand the sequence of this. Then they strangled him with picture wire. So a literal case, I would say, of overkill. And as revealed during their subsequent trial, their poor planning did not end there. Judd Gray had told the murder plot to a friend of his who he hoped would give him an alibi. That friend did not. All of which led the columnist Damon Runyon to call this crime the dumbbell murder. Well, you'd think that would be the end of it, but this case would have a lasting impact on books, movies, and popular culture to this day, thanks to this man, James M. Cain. At the time of the trial, Kane was a 36-year-old writer for newspapers and magazines based in New York City. And in 1933, Kane realized that a story loosely inspired by the Snyder Gray murder case could be a good starting point for a book, and it certainly was. Because Kane's novel, The Postman Always Rings Twice, published in 1934, was that novel. It was about a violent drifter, an unhappy wife, and the wife's husband, whom they kill. But soon the couple's seemingly perfect murder plot unravels, partly due to their lack of trust in each other. This book had explicit sex scenes for the time, it was banned in Boston, and it sold out of every bookstore that carried it. And of course, bestsellers get the attention of Hollywood. And early 1934 was still part of the so-called pre-code era of the movies, as you can see in these stills from The Sign of the Cross on the left and Red Dust. And even though the rules of censorship had been written by 1934 in something called the Motion Picture Production Code, well, as you can see, those rules were not being strictly enforced. So in 1934, MGM snapped up the rights to The Postman Always Rings Twice. But right after they bought the book, movie boycotts by the Catholic Legion of Decency and other groups convinced Hollywood that the production code had to be now enforced, fully enforced. So now there was no way that a book like The Postman Always Rings Twice could be filmed. Fortunately, novelists did not face the same censorship that filmmakers did, and in 1936, James M. Cain published another story involving a single man, an unhappy wife, and a husband who ends up dead. Double Indemnity was about an insurance salesman who is persuaded by the wife of one of his clients to kill her husband and make it look like a rare kind of accident, which doubles the amount of insurance paid. Does that sound familiar? It should. Well, once again, MGM contacted the censors at the Production Code Administration. Oh, I'm so sorry. We'll go this way. We want to go forward. There we are. MGM contacted the censors in the Production Code Administration, also known as the PCA, to see if there was any chance they could possibly film Double Indemnity, and the answer was a hard and fast no. The head of the PCA was Joseph Breen, a conservative Catholic who considered much of Hollywood's product to be smut. And in his rejection letter to MGM about Double Indemnity, Breen wrote, and I quote, "The story deals improperly with an illicit and adulterous sex relationship. The general low tone and sordid flavor of this story make it thoroughly unacceptable for screen production." Breen pointed out that the story's protagonists were, quote, "murderers who cheat the law." Also, the production code strictly forbade showing the details of how a murder is committed. And with that, I should have asked earlier, TJ or someone, would you mind bringing me a small water? That would be most helpful. Oh, it's right there. Look at that. Thank you. So I will let you take in the visage of Joseph Breen and his helpers for just a moment here. So yes, the production code forbade all of those things, including showing the details of how a murder is committed. Double Indemnity, Breen said, was a blueprint for murder. And just to make sure that no one else in Hollywood got any ideas about filming the story, he sent his letter not just to MGM, but also to Paramount, Columbia, and Warner Brothers. By the mid-1930s, with the production code now being fully enforced, Hollywood focused on telling happier, less problematic stories, and often, as we see, quite wonderful ones, the Astaire and Rogers series. Movies that helped people forget the Depression, however briefly, and then the world turned upside down. The bombing of Pearl Harbor on December 7th, 1941, pulled America into World War. By the time soldiers landed on the beaches of Normandy in 1944, America had been forced to face evil on a daily basis. And some filmmakers realized that viewers wanted to see dramas that reflected the harsh, brutal realities of the time. And leading the pack among those filmmakers was this gentleman, writer-director Billy Wilder. Now, today we know Wilder as the director and co-writer of movies like Sunset Boulevard and Some Like It Hot, but they came later. The Billy Wilder in our story is on his way there, but he isn't there yet. He was born in Austria in 1906, and he did a little of everything growing up. He was a so-called gigolo who danced with women for money. and he was a journalist. And here we have a clip of Billy Wilder talking about his early life. And I will say that the clips that we're going to see of Wilder come from the 1980s, and just listen closely. I think you'll be able to hear them.
I was brought as a kid of 2.5 years old to Vienna, and I went there to grammar school, then to high school. And the great endeavor of my father was, when you have two sons, one will become a lawyer, the other one will become a doctor. Well, I had a brother. Neither did he become a doctor, nor did I become a lawyer. I became a newspaperman. I was doing sports, which was mostly football in those days. I was also doing some reportage of a criminal nature. I would do the dirty work. My job would be, for instance, to go to the parents of somebody who was a murderer, who had committed a murder, to ask for a photograph.
Well, by 1930, Wilder was writing movies in Germany. Then, in 1933, Hitler took power, and Wilder, a Jew, fled to America. He taught himself English, and he found work in the studios as a screenwriter, which I think is quite remarkable how quickly he succeeded. And he showed a flair for snappy dialogue and solid story construction, and writing adult situations that flirted with crossing the line of censorship. By 1943, Wilder had moved up to the director's chair, making 2 hit films at his home studio of Paramount. But he didn't want to make just hits. He wanted to be one of the top filmmakers in the business. And for his 3rd project as director, he set out to make something that, in his words, would set Hollywood back on its heels, something juicy and controversial. And in 1943, he found the perfect source material. Double Indemnity had just been republished as part of the collection we see on the left, 3 of a kind. Legend has it that one day Billy Wilder's secretary went missing, and he learned that she was in the ladies' room reading Double Indemnity, and she couldn't put it down. True or not, who knows? Well, she may have loved it, but Wilder's usual writing partner, the urbane Charles Brackett, considered the story trash, and he refused to work on it. So Billy had to find a new writing partner for the project, because he always needed someone to bounce ideas off of. Fortunately, Wilder's producer, a man named Joe Sistrom, had an idea. Sistrom was a fan of another hard-boiled crime novelist who was just starting to attract attention, and his name was... Yeah, I heard it out there. Yes, Raymond Chandler. And he is the other key figure in this story. Chandler was a great writer, but a very troubled man. He was born in Chicago, and after his alcoholic father deserted the family, Ray and his mother moved to England, where she had family. And things looked bright when one of her relatives agreed to send Ray to the prestigious Dulwich College in London. But Ray felt out of place among all of the wealthy, upper-class students surrounding him. So at age 24, he traveled back to America, and eventually he began writing crime fiction for magazines like Black Mask. They gave so many of them their starts. Every cover is great if you have Black Mask magazine. Well, he may have been a great writer, but writing was never easy for him. When asked to describe his process of writing, Chandler famously said, "Throw up into your typewriter every morning. Clean up every noon." But nevertheless, in 1939, Chandler, at age 51, had his first novel published. The Big Sleep introduced the character who would become the best-known private eye in American fiction, Philip Marlowe. And by now, Chandler's writing style was stiletto sharp. He was witty, and he was keenly observant about human weakness and human corruption. He knew that he couldn't write the kind of orderly, precise plots that, say, Agatha Christie would write, and her colleagues. But as Chandler said, their words don't get up and walk. Mine do. Well, despite good reviews, The Big Sleep did not sell very well in 1939, and neither did his second novel, Farewell, My Lovely. By 1943, Chandler was nearly broke. He was drinking, and he was supporting not only himself, but a wife who was 17 years older than he was. She was nearing 70 years old, and she had a number of health problems. Then the phone rang, and everything changed, because Paramount Pictures wanted Raymond Chandler to work with Billy Wilder on the screenplay of Double Indemnity. By now, Wilder had read Chandler's novels, and as he later said, "I was crazy about the guy." Well, Wilder was crazy about Chandler, the writer, But it wasn't long before he despised Chandler the man, and the feeling turned out to be mutual. Chandler had contempt for Hollywood. He considered it a place of phonies pretending to have talent. But he was nearly broke, and he couldn't turn down $2,000 a week for several months of work. And $2,000 a week in 1943 is about $30,000 a week today. But for many reasons, Chandler still was not happy. For one thing, he loathed James M. Cain's writing. He once remarked, "Everything Cain touches smells like a billy goat. He is a dirty little boy with a piece of chalk." In addition to that, Chandler had always written by himself at home, but working on the script, he had to report to Paramount Pictures every day at 9 a.m. and fight over every word of the script with Billy Wilder. Now, during this period, Chandler was trying not to drink, which was also putting him in a very foul mood. He smoked a pipe every day in the office, but he would not let Billy Wilder open the window, saying the LA air was too bad, which drove Billy Wilder crazy. They were the original odd couple. And here we have Billy Wilder talking about Chandler.
Oh, he was something, a marvelous writer, just wonderful, but he was a nut. He hated me. He absolutely hated me because I knew more about the medium than he did, obviously, because I've been making pictures. I also was 40 years younger than he was, so maybe 50. I also had a lot of very pretty girls, and I also could drink. He was an AA. His wife was 40 years older than he was. We just didn't think the same way at all. But that's precisely this difference of opinions makes for a good collaborator. Because if two collaborators think the same way, the very same way, you don't need a collaborator. This is like pulling on one end of the rope. Two men, right? And no tension, no nothing.
Well, Billy was right about that, because despite Wilder and Chandler's intense mutual dislike, they created a terrific script. There was just still one more problem to get past, and that was, of course, the censors. 7 years had passed since Joseph Breen rejected any film of Double Indemnity, but Billy Wilder was determined to make it. And he and Paramount worked carefully and methodically with the Breen office to overcome every objection. Wilder agreed to play down the details of how the murder was committed. And when the murder happens in the film, pay attention to what Billy Wilder, the director, chooses to show at that moment. It is a brilliant decision, much better than showing the murder. Wilder got Joseph Breen to agree that the adulterous relationship could stay in the story as long as Billy made sure that not too much skin was shown on screen. Joseph Breen was obsessed with how much flesh actresses would be showing or not showing. So item by item, Billy Wilder got his way. And here is noir expert and my friend Eddie Muller explaining why the result was so revolutionary.
The biggest thing for me is that it's a story about the villains. It's about the bad people. And to me, that's the most influential thing about the movie. Its greatness is one thing, but I look at that as separate because there are geniuses involved. It's Billy Wilder and Raymond Chandler and all these great people. But the fact that it's a story in which the killers are the protagonists is what really changed everything. That, to me, that's the seismic shift in Hollywood. It's like the minute that was acceptable, everything changed. And I know that was his motivation for making this movie, was that's not the way we do things, Billy. You can't have the villains be the heroes of the piece, quote unquote. You can't show how people plan to commit murder. You can't do this and you can't do that. And, Billy Wilder was like a very smart little boy who's like, oh yeah, watch me do this. I'll pull this off.
Well, the screenplay didn't just get past the censors, it improved on James M. Cain's original novel. For starters, Chandler and Wilder changed the name of the main character, Walter Huff, to Walter Neff. And they changed the name of their femme fatale from Phyllis Nerdlinger to Phyllis Dietrichson. And I suspect that the Dietrichson was influenced by one of Billy Wilder's favorite actresses, Marlene Dietrich. Chandler and Wilder were both brilliant at crafting dialogue, and just about every word in this movie sizzles. This is an endlessly quotable movie. They also enriched the characters considerably. In the book, Walter's boss, a man named Keyes, doesn't really have a strong personal relationship with Walter. But in the movie, Keyes becomes the third major character. He is grooming Walter to be his successor. He loves Walter like a son. And a lot of the film's suspense comes from our wondering if and when Keyes finds out that Walter, whom he cares so much about, is the murderer he is trying to find. Now, the casting of Walter was a great example of casting against type, because Fred MacMurray was best known in 1944 as a light comic actor, a World War II era Tom Hanks, if you will. And here's Billy Wilder telling us what Fred MacMurray's first reaction was when he was offered the job.
He said, look, I can't play that. That requires acting. And I said, look, you got to make a big step, you know. I know you were a saxophone player. You played the saxophone and you know those comedies with Carol Lombard and the Ginger Rogers. But he says, all right, I'll do it.
Fred MacMurray is an incredible stroke of genius casting this guy. And I love what Billy Wilder said, that he was perfect because he's the all-American salesman. It's like, I don't want to cast a guy who looks sinister or anything. I want to cast a guy who knocks on your door and you open the door and you accept him as, what's he selling? Vacuum cleaners or what? Oh no, it's insurance. And inside this character is this sociopath. That was really the first time I think that character was depicted, at least in a picture of this much prestige. And that's why I think it's such a subversive film, and why it did kind of kick a lot of things loose and is so responsible for fostering what we now know as the film noir movement.
And if that weren't enough, of course, we have Barbara Stanwyck as Phyllis, and Stanwyck could play anything. In this movie, she is funny, sexy, and deadly. There is one controversial aspect about Phyllis on screen, and we'll talk about that later. Edward G. Robinson gives a beautiful and ultimately very moving performance as Walter's boss, Keyes. And speaking of casting, there is one more person to mention. Watch this short clip very closely and see if you can recognize anyone else that we've been talking about.
Now get out of here before I throw my desk at you. I love you too. I really did too, you old crab. I was yelling your head off. I was sore at everybody.
Who is that man? It is. This is Raymond Chandler. looking the way he probably did every day in Billy Wilder's office. Well, at this point, we should talk very briefly about the look of film noir and what we mean when we call something noir. Big topic. I'll keep it short. First of all, there is no one-size-fits-all definition for what makes a movie film noir. Some critics feel it's based on the content, others say it's based on the look. For today, I'm going to go with Oxford Dictionary's definition, which is a genre of crime film or fiction characterized by cynicism, fatalism, and moral ambiguity. Many film noir titles were influenced by the German expressionist cinema of the 1920s and 30s, which very much reflected the dark feelings in Germany after World War I. For Double Indemnity, cinematographer John Seitz found the perfect balance between that often extreme German lighting of style and a more naturalistic approach. And here are historians Imogen Sarah Smith and Eddie Muller talking about John Seitz's approach.
He was always really known as an innovator and an experimental cinematographer, and in particular known for loving to work with extremely low light. And he's certainly still doing that in Double Indemnity. I mean, there's some gorgeous scenes that are almost in total blackness.
I find it fascinating that when Wilder talked about his work on this film, he said what he really appreciated was Seitz's ability to capture things naturally. He found there was a naturalism in his photography, yet when you watch the film, it also has all of the visual motifs that you associate with film noir. So it's this amazing combination of like an expressionistic, very theatrical approach to the lighting when it's appropriate. But then at other times, he captures that California light.
It really illustrates how much more diversity there could be in the noir look than just the high contrast, very graphic style that people think of first.
And I don't think I've ever seen another example of an actor, in this case Barbara Stanwyck, crediting the cinematographer for enhancing her performance, because she said the way he lit the sets and the way the house felt when she came on set, she said it was all one incredible mood that she could just walk right into and become Phyllis.
Double Indemnity premiered on June 14th, 1944, and the movie, once called unfilmable by the censors, was a hit with both audiences and critics. James M. Cain said this about the movie: "It is the only picture I ever saw made from my books that had things in it I wish I had thought of. Wilder's ending was much better than my ending. And his device for letting the guy tell the story by taking out the office dictating machine, I would have done that if I'd thought of it. There are situations in the movie that can make your hands get wet." Double Indemnity received 7 Academy Award nominations, including Best Picture, Best Director, and Best Screenplay. And it opened the floodgates for countless movies now considered film noir, including Chandler's The Big Sleep, Cain's Mildred Pierce, and yes, they finally got around and were able to make The Postman Always Rings Twice. So, with that, let's watch the film. And again, I hope you can stay with me for just a little bit longer afterwards so that I can share 3 short stories about its making with you. And I would love to hear your thoughts about it as well. So, with that, thank you for listening, and let's watch Double Indemnity. Thank you. Still holds up, wouldn't you say? Amazing. And that's actually a good segue, because if you want to see the more of the interviews that I've been sharing with you, you will find most of them on that excellent Blu-ray of Double Indemnity that Criterion Collection released, which you can check out of the Rancho Mirage Library. I'll just take a moment, by the way, to say I hope that you come back next week. Thank you. Come back next week, because if you haven't seen 42nd Street before or saw it a long time ago and think it's just a frothy musical, it is not. It is as gritty in some ways as this movie is. It was made during the Depression. It has a real edge to it, and also it's the real breakthrough movie for Busby Berkeley. So there are a lot of things going for it that are worth looking at, I think, these days, and it's hugely entertaining. Well, back to Double Indemnity, some very quick stories on this. Originally, I was so caught up in the movie, I forgot that I had to quote the screenplay here, so let me get this for you. Originally, that was not the end of the film. There was one more scene in which we do indeed see Walter's execution in the gas chamber, something referred to 3 times in the movie, I noticed. I was counting this time. And this was an unusually grisly finale for a movie in 1944, and the censors were against it also. They really cautioned Wilder about doing it, but he thought it was necessary, and at no small cost, he recreated the gas chamber at San Quentin. And here you see one of the few stills, because the footage no longer survives. And the scene, as written, has a moving finale. Certainly I can understand why Wilder wanted to film this. A quote from the last page of the script. Keyes, unable to watch, looks away. He mechanically reaches a cigar out of his vest pocket and puts it in his mouth. His hands, in the now familiar gesture, begin to pat his pockets for matches. Suddenly, he stops with a look of horror on his face. He stands rigid, pressing a hand against his heart. He takes the cigar out of his mouth and goes slowly on towards the door. Keyes walks out into the sunshine, stiffly, his head bent, a forlorn and lonely man. So that's how the script ended. Well, Wilder did indeed film that, but when he watched the completed movie with that scene, he realized he didn't need that last scene. He could end with that great long 2-shot of Walter and Keyes and composer Miklos Rocha's score with that great throbbing repeated pattern on it, building powerfully on the soundtrack. And by the way, that is the sound of noir in the 40s and 50s. It isn't a saxophone. That's TV crime shows. That's the sound of noir in the 40s and 50s. So, despite all that expense and fighting the censors, Wilder cut that gas chamber scene. So, on a lighter note, remember where I said there was something controversial about Barbara Stanwyck's performance? Did you guess what it was? Yes, it is the wig. And here to say more about that is Eddie Muller.
You know, when people are critical of the film, which is not often, but the few criticisms you do hear is the wig, and she's fake. And honestly, I have imagined this character without the wig. And the problem I have is that Barbara Stanwyck as an actress will make you believe anything. She's the greatest actress in the history of Hollywood. And you can have her do anything, and if she is playing it straight and natural, you believe it. And you sympathize with her. So I think it was very essential to change something up, because I don't think Wilder wanted that. I think he wanted to show how false this woman was. As they famously said, we hired Barbara Stanwyck and we got George Washington.
So again, in a moment when we turn this into a conversation, love your thoughts on that or anything else. And then finally, that great scene of Stanwyck hiding behind the door. Did you notice the way that Billy Wilder cheated reality a little bit? Well, here he is from a German language interview with subtitles. Here he is to explain.
Who do you suspect?
Well, maybe I like to make things easy for myself, but I always tend to suspect the beneficiary. I've got to get to a drugstore. This thing feels like a hunk of concrete inside me. Good night, Walter.
Good night, Keys.
Wo versteckt sie sich? Und da habe ich den Mann auf die Bühne kommen lassen, den Konstrukteur der Dinge. Und die Türe macht sich in den Korridor auf, dass sich da verstecken kann, nicht?
See you at the office in the morning.
Yeah.
I'd like to move in on her right now, tonight. If it wasn't for Norton and his tri-pants ideas about company policy, I'd have the police after her so fast it'd make her head spin. They put her through the ringer. And, brother, the things they would squeeze out.
Keine Türe der Welt macht sich in den Korridor auf. Sonst haust du mir ins Gesicht, nicht? Niemand hat's gemerkt.
And one of those things?
Well, before we get into our discussion, if later you'd like to get in touch with me, I just wanted to mention you can do that easily through the library, through my website, mediasteven.com. And talking about Miklos Rocha's music, I couldn't resist mentioning that, yes, I have written 2 books on film composers, one on the great Bernard Herrmann, one on Max Steiner, both of whom scored a lot of great noir dramas, along with other films like Herrmann and Hitchcock and Steiner and Casablanca. But those are stories for another time. And at this point now, happily, I would like to turn this over to all of you and hear your thoughts on the movie. First, maybe see if you had any questions that I could answer, and then just have a discussion. And please, of course, know that anyone can leave whenever they need to. Any questions? Yes, right there.
I've seen it 3 times. I love it every time. I've also seen the remake, and in each one of those, Lee Cobb was just great in the remake, as well as the guy who played Keys.
Richard Crenna was in a TV movie version in the 70s. Is that the one you're thinking of? Well, this is the only theatrical feature of Double Indemnity. The next version was a TV movie in 1973. Perhaps it's one with a similar plot. I'll have to look that up because that 1973 movie fell into instant obscurity. It got terrible reviews and only got hit for trying to remake this movie. So I'm sure there is a movie with a similar plot, and perhaps that's what you're thinking of. Edward G. Robinson. Yes. Anyone else? Thoughts, questions? Or, right here in the front.
Yeah, I've seen it 3 or 4 times also, and the door opening out always bothers me because I think that's against fire film.
Well, yes, it's what Hitchcock would call movie logic. And I have to say that Hitchcock was loath to give a lot of credit to other directors. When asked who his favorite other filmmakers were, he'd be very vague. Somehow he thought that was hurting his brand. And he did a very uncharacteristic thing when this movie opened in 1944. He made a public statement that Billy Wilder had made a great film and how important a filmmaker he was in Hollywood. And I'm researching a Hitchcock project now, and I think that's almost unprecedented for him to go out of his way to praise someone. And indeed, Wilder had said going into this film that he wanted to out-Hitchcock Hitchcock. So he set his sights high. Yes, Robert.
Where was Robinson in his career when this movie was
That's a good question. Robinson was still a movie star, name above the title. He would get into some unfortunate trouble, none of it his own making, with the blacklisting, the Red Scare of the late 40s and early 50s. He was liberal, and that got him into the magazine called Red Channels that basically told producers and filmmakers who they should and shouldn't hire, and he ended up in that. And it was Cecil B. DeMille, ironically, a very conservative filmmaker, who said, I want Edward G. Robinson for the 10 Commandments, and after that he was back in A Pictures. But in 1944, when he made this, he actually had to be talked into taking what was a supporting role. He's still name above the title. It's the three of them in Double Indemnity, but there's no question it's a supporting role. And I think that may be part of the reason that he gets such fantastic dialogue. Of course, practically everybody does, but I can never get tired of the scene where he's listing all the kinds of suicide there are, done in one take, one take, and it's just, and then of course taking the glass of water at the end of it is just perfect, and that may be my favorite performance of his, although there are so many others. And in fact, this sort of is not only the beginning for a lot of people of film noir thematically, but it's the beginning of Edward G. Robinson in film noir. And if you haven't seen the movies Scarlet Street and The Woman in the Window, those are a great double bill of Edward G. Robinson noir, and there are, of course, others. So, yes, sir.
Was the author of Double Indemnity King, was he upset that they brought in Raymond Chandler to kind of work on this for them?
No, he was not upset at all, and it's kind of ironic because Kane was in Hollywood under contract to another studio, doing writing for someone else. So he didn't seem upset with it, and I'm sure was very happy that Billy Wilder was taking it on. I don't think there was any love lost between him and Raymond Chandler, but they were very polite to each other personally. Those nasty things that Chandler said about Kane were said in a letter to one of Chandler's friends. They in those days, didn't engage in public fighting too much. So no, and then of course Kane loved this. He really didn't like, he didn't like the film of Mildred Pierce for reasons that I won't get into, but basically involved just changes for the book, changes that I think actually make it a better movie. Sometimes sometimes books work as books, but you need to make changes for film. Another story for another time. But I don't think he was too disappointed. And Kane saw Hollywood as a way to get quick money, the way a lot of novelists did. And James M. Cain lived into the 1980s, and he wrote science fiction, he wrote romance novels, he wrote all these different kind of books. The one thing that did upset him was that he never, after Postman Always Rings Twice and Double Indemnity, he could never get people to stop referring to him as hard-boiled novelist. He said, come on, I write about cooking, I write about opera, I write about this, I do other things. So he was typecast, but, typecasting goes both ways. It was not a bad thing to be famous for the rest of your life for Mildred Pierce, Postman Always Rings Twice, and Double Indemnity, most of all. So thank you for asking. And with that, I don't want to overstay my welcome, but again, I hope you will return for 42nd Street next Monday and the day the Earth stood still, the week after that. And thank you all so much for coming, and thank you to the Rancho Mirage Library.